For everyone joining us, welcome. We'll be starting at 2:05. So I think it's 2:05, and Dwight will be introducing our speakers for this webinar.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Welcome, everyone, to our penultimate edition of the Plagues and Pandemics History of Now seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce Laura Spinney and Dr. Brazelton. Laura Spinney is an author and science journalist. She has published 2 novels in English, The Doctor and The Quick. Her third book of nonfiction, Rue Central, came out in 2013, and a fourth, A Tale of the Spanish Flu, called The Pale Rider, was published in June 2017. Deburance, Where the Devils Came Down, her translation of Charles Ferdinand Ramos's best-loved novel, was published in 2018. She also writes on science for the National Geographic, The Economist, Nature, New Scientist, and The Telegraph, amongst others. Dr. Brazelton is a senior lecturer in global studies of science and technology and medicine at Cambridge. Her 2019 book, Mass Vaccination, Citizens' Bodies and State Power in Modern China, examines the history of mass immunization in 20th century China. It suggests that the origins of the vaccination policies that eradicated smallpox and controlled other infectious diseases in the 1950s provides an important basis for the emergence of Chinese health policy as a model for global public health. Dr. Brazelton is also an affiliated lecturer in East Asian Studies at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies and an associate member of the World History Subject Group in the History Faculty, as well as a trustee and research fellow of the Needham Research Institute and the director of studies for HBS at Lucy Cavendish and St. Catherine's College. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sana to I'll turn it over to the speakers to briefly introduce their work. And Sana, do you want to?
Sure. We'd asked our speakers to briefly introduce their work and, try and sort of tell us what lessons we might learn from their works on the Spanish flu and on, vaccinations in China that might help us think through this topic of sovereignties, policing and power as we go through the COVID-19 pandemic. So Laura, did you want to start us off? And then Mary, you could take over after. Thanks.
Sure. So I'm sitting here in Paris in lockdown. I can't go further than 1 kilometer from my house, and I have to fill out a form every time I do. So it seems an appropriate subject given, for sanitary reasons, our liberties have been somewhat curtailed. I'm going to speak about the Spanish flu. I should probably clarify that my tale of the Spanish flu was a non-fiction tale. And given we're talking about assertions of sovereignty and statehood, it seems important to start by saying that the so-called Spanish flu, the 1918 flu, was very exceptional in one important way, which was that it overlapped with a war, obviously the First World War. And so it erupted in the middle of an almighty struggle for sovereignty and for borders and over state power. And in fact, though the political situation can't be blamed for the spillover events that triggered the pandemic, you could certainly argue that it exacerbated it. And some researchers have gone further. I'll come back to that. But I think it's pretty clear from what the Spanish flu, however exceptional it was, what it emphasizes is how entangled these things are. And as I've argued, and plenty of people before me, you can't think of a pandemic as just a biological phenomenon. It's also a social, political, economic phenomenon. So the politicization starts with the name, and the Spanish flu is another very good example of that, because it's got to be one of the greatest historical injustices in history that it was called Spanish. We don't know, obviously, I think probably most of the people I'm talking to here know this story. We don't know where it started. There are 3 leading theories at the moment, which correspond to origins in China, in the United States, and at a British military camp in northern France. We can't choose between those theories at the moment, but we do know for sure that it did not start in Spain, because we know there were cases prior to that in other countries. And the reason it was called the Spanish flu is because Spain was neutral in the war, did not censor its press. So when it had its first cases in the spring of 1918, newspapers reported on it in Spain, whereas the warring countries censored their press. And so it seemed to everyone, including the Spanish, that it was rippling out from their country. But even though those circumstances were rather exceptional, I think that it's clear from history that fear and xenophobia and fear of the other, as well as fear of the germ, goes hand in hand with pandemics. And of course, we've seen that again this time with Donald Trump's attempts to call this the Chinese disease, the Wuhan virus, and so on, and the Chinese efforts back to call it the American disease. And, it may look like, I think, a kind of playground squabbling to us now while we're in the midst of it. It's not the most important subject, but I think the politicians know very well that names tend to stick, and that, maybe 100 years from now, that's all that many people will know about it. And therefore the name could have serious consequences in geopolitical and other terms. I just wanted to mention, by the by, that the WHO in 2015 issued naming guidelines for new diseases, which was an attempt to sort of address what is really a genuine dilemma in the case of every new emerging disease, especially if it's as severe and causes a pandemic like this one, which is that you do need to name it quite early on in order to be able to talk about it and discuss problem, understand it, and propose solutions. But at the beginning, by definition, you don't know very much about it. So often those names turn out to be misnomers, and then the politics gets layered on top of that. But I think it's really interesting that the WHO seems to have had some success this time around. I mean, it looks to me, at least in this point in time, that this disease will be called COVID-19 and not the Wuhan flu. So there's even an argument from evolutionary biology that the war is the reason why the Spanish flu, I should stop calling it that, the 1918 flu was as bad as it was, at least 25 times as lethal as any other flu pandemic that's been vaguely measured in history. And the idea is that that conditions on the Western Front, where men were very closely packed together in the trenches and where sick individuals, rather than being isolated from the well, were carried into pools of susceptible hosts, tent to train to a series of hospitals. And in a way, we removed the evolutionary pressure on the virus to moderate its virulence and even perhaps push that virulence up. And that's one argument for why it was so lethal. I've actually just been talking about that in an article in The Guardian yesterday, but we can talk about it more later if you're interested. So after the pandemic receded, many countries which had not had ministries of health at that time and realized that it had been a shortcoming not to have their public health experts represented at the top table in terms of powers and resources, now created or reorganized their ministries of health. And you also see the creation of international health agencies. That was just the sort of, I think of it as the acceleration of a trend that had started in the previous century with the international sanitary conferences. But now you see the League of Nations, which of course was created after the Versailles Treaty, after the First World War, that has its own health branch. There are a number of other international organizations, and these collectively could be thought of as the forerunners of the WHO, which was created after the Second World War. So there was a recognition that you needed an international response, a coordinated international response to an international problem. And I think these two shifts to the creation of more ministries of health and the creation of international health agencies both serve to make health political and international at the same time. And these two things can be very difficult to reconcile, I think, as we're seeing in this pandemic. You know, before this one erupted, we were already seeing a retreat from international cooperation in many domains. And I think it was reflected in the chronic underfunding of the WHO and the fact that it's, you know, widely considered in public health circles to be less effective than the CDC in its overseas operations. So, you know, there was a long discussion, there was a debate that predates this pandemic about whether the WHO was fit for purpose and whether it needed reforming. In fact, it's in a process of reform. But you know, when you take the historical perspective on it, then it's not a surprise to think of the WHO as inevitably political and politicized. I think, you know, there's an interesting debate going on about why it stuck to its line of keeping borders open when the scientific evidence is very much more ambiguous on that. Did it do so? It's being accused of having done so for political rather than scientific reasons. And I think it's very clear to everybody that the WHO has sort of been hijacked as a kind of arena for the trade war between US and China. So the result is that its ability to coordinate national responses has been weakened, perhaps even removed. And we've seen this kind of national patchwork of responses, lack of international coordination, and most recently, something that has also happened in previous pandemics, which is rich countries buying up in advance stocks of any vaccines that are approved, despite valiant attempts to put in place mechanisms that would ensure equitable access. So just to finish, I think that at this point, China is only, where of course the pandemic started, as far as we know, is only reporting imported cases, and its economy is already recovering, something that can't be said for most of the countries in the rest of the world. And so it is a legitimate question to ask whether democracy is incompatible with good pandemic management. There's plenty of evidence that it is. There are other countries that have done well as well, that are democratic, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, for example. And I would argue that the problem lies more in the relationships between countries than within them. And that the problem may be the same with climate change. And so, maybe what we need to do is think about how we can manage those relationships, and I don't, whether the WHO is the response or not in the health domain, to try to solve these problems as effectively as we can. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. And we'll come back to some of the themes that you raised in our discussion. Mary, please go ahead.
Great, well, thank you. And I should say thank you to the MIT faculty as well for putting this together and for having us in this series. So I'm coming to you from Cambridge, UK, where I currently can go more than 1 kilometer outside my house, but the country is under a national lockdown. That said, as a staff member of a university teaching is still going ahead, in many cases in person. So there are interesting gray areas, I think, and questions of responsibility. Responsibility has been a word that's been in the news here in terms of discourses of how individuals should be taking care, wearing masks, and keeping the R down, so to speak. And yet, as a historian of science and medicine, I've been deeply concerned with some of these questions of responsibility in a very different context when it comes to public health. So I'm very much concerned with thinking about the role that public health has played in historical relationships between state and society, state and people in modern China. So I'll first say a very little bit about my work, and then a few ways that I think it relates to the current situation. So in my recent book, which Professor Banerjee mentioned, I suggest that in 20th century China, mass immunization and technologies of mass immunization helped construct biotechnological systems of political control over the course of the 20th century. So we typically think of mass vaccination, this set of people, materials, and systems that supported the production of immunity against particular diseases. We typically think of that in the Chinese context as something that is a product of the current People's Republic of China. World Health Organization narratives very much stress the work that was done in the 1950s to vaccinate against smallpox, cholera, typhoid fever. And vaccines existed against all kinds of diseases that aren't necessarily used now, of course, in a contemporary context. And yet, if one looks at the archives and publications, we can see the articulation of systems of mass immunization against a variety of infectious diseases earlier in the 20th century, and especially during the years of the Second Sino-Japanese War, so the Chinese theater, so to speak, of the Second World War. And these programs were then expanded quite dramatically after the Chinese Communist Party consolidated power in the 1950s. And the control of infectious diseases to which they contributed offered a basis for China to emerge as a model in global health more broadly. We see this over the course of the 1970s, especially with growing emphases on primary health care. So these grassroots mobilizations from below, so to speak, that emerge as the ideals in global health. Those often cite China and China's rural health systems as a model. And those rural health systems' success is often cited in such arguments. And that success, I would argue, depends in part on the epidemic control that we see emerging in part through mass immunization, this product of long 20th century processes. So the trend we see is one in which the Republic and then the People's Republic of China asserted increasing responsibility for vaccinating and protecting the immunity of citizens. And that responsibility brought the power of the state to bear, binding people into increasingly strong obligations to submit to governmental mandates for immunization. So relatively quickly, there are 3 points about China's current response to COVID that I think have historical resonance in terms of state power, assertions of sovereignty, and policing. The first is the connection between public health and state legitimacy. Domestic discontent and social anxieties caused by early reluctance to address the epidemic danger in Wuhan posed, I think, a fairly serious threat to domestic stability at various points in China. So Weibo and other online forums provided a site for the articulation of frustration and veiled even direct criticism of early government responses. And we see this more on the local level. So the Wuhan city government's failure to take rapid action or to manage perhaps the epidemic ultimately made it a target. And it ultimately made it a target for harsh censure by the central party state in efforts to remediate this crisis. So the central state's move to issue extensive quarantine orders, mobilize large amounts of human labor to build and staff hospitals in a matter of days, suggested a public demonstration of investments in rapid, intensive epidemic response. So I would suggest that we see public health interventions perhaps as a means of regaining public confidence, but also revealing the extent to which issues of health may be connected to questions of state legitimacy and power. And certainly this is an argument that the book makes, that we see these successive governments, first the Republic and then the People's Republic of China, employing public health strategies and especially immunization to demonstrate competence and even benevolence in providing healthcare for the people. So the second connection that I see is the significance of epidemiological surveillance. One of the other arguments I make is that as the state's capacity to vaccinate citizens increased over the 20th century, so too did its capacity to keep records of those vaccinations, of those interventions. New systems of record keeping, surveillance, and accountability accompanied the implementation of some of these policies. So thinking about that crucial period in the 1950s, vaccination records started to employ classifying markers such as gender and age, and to track individuals' immunization status in a way that we don't necessarily see in previous decades. We also see vaccinations getting mapped onto a system called the hukou, the household register, one of the primary means by which the state is tracking households. And a vaccine certificate is set up to control travel. That actually has historical roots going back to the Second World War, the use of vaccination certificates to allow people to cross borders, board airplanes, board boats. So that is an interesting continuity to trace. Today, of course, with COVID, record keeping and surveillance look quite different, perhaps integrated into mobile phones and social networks. And yet it is still, of course, a critical part of public health administration, especially in COVID response in China. And as in previous decades, it's still in some ways organized in terms of households. So one of the things I've been really interested to see in the Chinese response is the newfound or renewed significance, perhaps, of neighborhood committees, so sometimes called 居委会, whose members are enforcing rules that pertain to community members. So the people running the temperature checks, checking that the seal on an apartment door hasn't necessarily been broken for those who are meant to be quarantining for 14 days after entering a community. And those positions, from what I've been able to gather sitting here in Cambridge, aren't necessarily paid. They're often voluntary. They also have histories. Some of these structures of local government interventions date quite far back to the early PRC. And so I think we can see really interesting local networks of responsibility and care, the intensification of local administration and government in ways that I think have interesting historical resonance. Finally, and this is my final point, it's been so fascinating to think about faith or assertion of vaccination as a technological solution to a health crisis that has in some ways shown us social and political dimensions of crisis. So the institute at the center of my book in many ways, a group called the National Epidemic Prevention Bureau, is now called the National Vaccine and Serum Institute in Beijing. It's had quite a long history. There are lots of breaks and gaps in that history, of course, but you do see some historical continuities. On May 30th, this current institute claimed to have finished building the world's largest inactivated vaccine production facility for COVID-19, with production estimates of about 100 million doses a year. Of course, these are reports that are not always necessarily easy to verify. But it goes to show that the connections between past and present can actually be fairly direct. Certainly the symbolic significance of the publicization of such a plant, such an institute, is one that I think is worth paying attention to. In the mid-20th century, we see vaccines in China being presented as a health intervention that can in some ways perhaps make up for an inability to establish sanitary infrastructure comprehensively across all of China. They're preventive, they're able to be used on mobile populations, they serve the people, thus ticking many priorities, especially for the New People's Republic. And so we see this, I think, emphasis on vaccination enduring, despite issues like resistance to compulsory immunization, logistical problems in effectively producing and distributing vaccines, the emergence of health crises that a quick jab can't necessarily resolve. And so I think today we're seeing vaccination emerge, not just in China perhaps, but in many places, as this ideal solution, the cause for hope, in ways that certainly speak to the technological advances in vaccine production, but I think also speak to the desire to provide a technological solution, perhaps to a crisis that is bigger than technological in nature. So I'll stop there.
So I wanted to take us back a little bit into history and then get us back into the present day. And so I had a question for Laura, as you were talking about, reminding us that the flu of 1918 really was at that moment of the First World War. And there were these, global changes, right, and disruptions that were already in process, and the pandemic then comes in. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more, especially for those in our audience who haven't had the chance to read your wonderful book, on the ways in which you see the pandemic the flu pandemic really creating disruptions that then triggered a whole host of historical changes as far as ideas of sovereignty and governance and surveillance are concerned. And I was particularly interested in hearing a little bit more about the examples that you choose sort of globally in India, with the anti-colonial nationalist movement in South Africa, where you make an argument, in fact, about the beginnings of that apartheid state, that the repercussions of which we even sort of see decades later. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more, to what extent was the surveillance measures that were put into place really not coming out so much from the pandemic, but in fact the war, and how that then sort of changes the nature even of thinking about the government and power and the role of the power, and the extent to which then people's power is also able to resist that. As I had said to Laura earlier before the webinar started, I've spent most of the last 2 decades of my life immersed in South Asian historiography, where the plague of the late 19th century that our regular attendees, heard, we started off this webinar with that, that sort of looms large in our popular memories in the historiography, not so much the Spanish flu, right? And it was actually reading Laura's book over this summer that I said, wait, how do we not know this? So there are these interesting ways in which that story of the war and the post-war years is sort of told as this nationalist, that's the disruption, when in fact, I think Laura shows very interestingly the connections, in fact, between the global pandemic and local sort of politics, political and social change. So I wanted to invite Laura to speak a little bit more on that for the benefit of our audience.
I suppose that, where to start? So I was fortunate enough to be able to interview Thomas Piketty earlier this year about his vast historical study that he published recently, and we were talking about the effects of pandemics, and his main point was that if you look back through history, they tend to exacerbate trends that are sort of already in place, but those trends might be different in different places. I mean, I'd written my book by that time before speaking to him and before his was published, but I think that I would have to say that I saw similar things. I mean, the World War was a world war, though of course some countries are affected more than others. But if you talk about what was going on in distinct countries, in South Africa, there had already been discussion of segregating cities, for example, long before the pandemic, but now this comes into force. It's now actually acted upon. And I think that you can, you know, and I'm not the first one to have done it. Historians in South Africa have argued previously that the blaming of whites and blacks of whites for this calamity kind of fixed those ideas, I think, in people's minds, and you see concrete action taken then. And you know, that had cast a very long shadow. It was a very long time since apartheid was turned over. In India, I was trying to suggest that, I mean, I was just puzzled by India. 18 million dead in India alone, which is it's not the highest death rate, but it's the highest number of dead in absolute numbers of any country in the world from the 1918 flu. And it's the equivalent of the death toll of the entire First World War. I was trying to show how definitely overshadowed by the plague epidemics, the previous plague epidemic, to the extent that people remembered, you know, it was in living memory, the kind of very draconian measures that were taken by the British against plague, you know, completely unscientific, at least to begin with, because they didn't realize what was the vector of disease. So those memories were very much alive, and there was a sense in which people realized, I think, how underpowered the public health provision was for Indians. And of course, the war exacerbated that, because the few doctors that there were tended to be away at the front. Nursing was in its infancy in India. And so what you see is kind of like grassroots movements linked to the independence movement stepping into the breach at the call of the British government, actually, who acknowledged that they were completely, you know, could not cope, could not respond. And so these people step in. And I think, you know, they didn't necessarily bring much relief to the actual flu, but what it did was it mobilized them and brought them into contact with different groups in different areas. Then you see the kind of growth of grassroots support for Gandhi, who at that time was already being recognized in sort of elite independence circles as a future leader, but didn't have the grassroots support at that time. It's an argument. Not everybody agrees, and obviously it's very difficult to control for all the confounding factors. But I thought, you know, that there were ways that you could trace, and I think you can see it in all sorts of different parts of the world, that you can trace the impact of the pandemic in ways that aren't necessarily very explicit or obvious.
Thank you for that, Laura and Mary. Yeah, when you were talking about your confusion about how little this has been accounted for in Indian history, I was really struck by that too. And I was just reading one of the best, actually, historians of health of India writing about the epidemic, about the flu, and saying that it just happened too fast and it was too devastating for history to record. And this is unlike him anywhere else. It's this aporia which I find really interesting and fascinating. I want to go back to something you mentioned, and that kind of raises issues Mary talks about in her book. So much of the talk around China has been how an authoritarian regime was able to impose its unilateral will in managing the disease, something that cannot work in Western democracies. And it's something that strikes me as completely plausible. But what I find so exciting about your work is that you don't accept the zero-sum game of personal freedom and effective public health response. In fact, it seems to me that your book offers a different picture of the state and civil society relation in China, in which mass mobilization of people as a resource was a key ingredient to the successful eradication of smallpox. So I was wondering, could you, for again, those who haven't read the book, can you help us understand the particularity of this form of sovereign relation over health? Or to put that differently, how does China's past idea of thinking of people as a resource that could be mobilized rather than just an object of authoritarian intervention, as we now think of it often, play into its response to COVID-19 in the present?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really important question, given how often we see the connection being made to China as an authoritarian state who can just go and do things. And I think the picture is much, much, much more complicated than that. But to get to that question of people as a mass resource and the historical connotations therein, I think for me, the connection lies in questions of motivations for these kinds of conceptualizations, context of war. And I'm sorry, because I'm getting a message saying that my internet connection is unstable. So I am sorry if I dropped out there for a minute. But in the early campaigns against smallpox that you mention in the early People's Republic of China, mass mobilization of people in the name of health was first developed in a wartime setting associated with the conflicts of the Korean War between 1950 and 1952. So mass campaigns to sweep streets, spray DDT in many, many places, and vaccinate people against infectious diseases were presented in the form of patriotic hygiene campaigns, literally 爱国卫生运动. That were specifically born in a period of war as a matter of national defense against a foreign enemy. So people, the people are a mass resource insofar as they are resisting against a foreign enemy, and that enemy was largely conceptualized as the United States, fighting on behalf of South Korea, whom at the time, China and North Korea had accused of conducting germ warfare in their territory. These were widely publicized allegations at the time. The US has always denied them. Ruth Rogowski has done a brilliant study of why the particularities of the allegations matter much less than the fact that they gave rise to this patriotic hygiene campaign. And in that context of uniting against a foreign enemy, personal sacrifices for the greater good, like going through the inconvenience and discomfort of getting a vaccine, like going out and doing street sweeping or other public health work that you perhaps don't really want to do with your spare day in your newly set up work unit in the early People's Republic of China. Those issues are linked to questions of national belonging and survival for a new nation that is suddenly facing this quite serious military threat. And it's worth pointing out that there is actually a longer genealogy to trace there, one that goes back again to the Second World War, to the decades of war, really, that China experienced, civil and international, that we see over the late 1930s and 1940s, where epidemic prevention is a military strategy in some senses. Certainly the government of China before the Communist Party takes over, the Nationalist Republic of China, treats epidemic prevention as a military strategy to protect its people against Japanese invasion. So I think, to me, there is a question of how thinking of people as a mass resource for questions of national survival in kind of a global context is quite compelling. Today, it's easy to kind of look and say, oh, well, the US is still the enemy for China in crucial ways. Certainly the rhetoric around Trump's use of the term Chinese vaccine, the Chinese efforts to suggest that maybe the vaccine was developed in the US and spread in China, you know, things like that. I think those speak to that kind of political context. But I think what's much more interesting to me is to pursue the questions in which people are mobilized as a mass resource in terms of networks of responsibility. So the neighborhood committees I was mentioning earlier, I think that is a case where you're seeing a reliance on voluntary labor that perhaps is mediated by certain conditions and pressures, and yet is relying on a concept of community, of individuals in communities needing to contribute to the public health of that relatively small scale of administration. So there are big questions of national defense, but at the same time, I think there are quite small scale questions of mutual responsibility that brings up.
Could I just add a point to that? I thought it was really fascinating, and actually in 1918, you saw, for example, in the US, the messaging got blurred. It's not quite clear to what extent it was deliberate, but it definitely was to some extent deliberate, where it became, for example, your patriotic duty to wear your mask and to comply with the various public health measures that were put in place. So it's really interesting to see those parallels.
You know, on this question of the message getting blurred, right, and what the message is and who puts out the message, I was wondering if Laura could put on her hat as a science journalist, because we are at a moment where the dissemination of information, but also misinformation, is massive, right? And that's sort of the technological innovations, the smartphones, the internet, right? This is the first pandemic in that era of information and misinformation. And I wondered, you know, as even Mary was talking about sort of the responsibility, right? The responsibility and obligations and the local sort of unpaid people who are brought into public health surveillance of, you know, checking the seal and reporting then, right? In a way, spying on your neighbor and things. You know, I wondered, as far as science journalism is concerned, what are the ethical questions that you grapple with in this need to very urgently and quickly put out information, and yet sort of be in that moment where, you know, the science, both sides argue to follow the science. As you know, there are these assumptions that the science is one thing and that the science in fact agrees with itself, right? So what are the ethical questions as a science journalist in this moment of quick information, you know, this milieu of not really having the luxury to brew and think about the ethics before you sort of produce the paper that you grapple with? And I think that might be helpful for all of us to think through the information that comes in, information that in fact is very quickly changing. You know, one example is you know, do we wear the mask or we don't? Do we follow earlier CDC guidelines not to, or current CDC guidelines to, right? So what are the ethical questions that science journalists have grappled with that might help us think through some of these questions of responsibility and mobilization?
I mean, I think they're the same ethical questions we always face, but as you say, the acceleration makes it very hard to keep up. And, you know, I mean, fake news has always accompanied pandemics. You know, there's a sense in which they sort of piggyback on each other. And I think that we do have an enormous problem today just because of the volume and speed of, you know, with which information can be transmitted by the internet, and the fact that you can sort of exist in one bubble, one backwater of that, or front water, whichever you want to call it, of that internet, happily without knowing what else is out there, and trying to juggle that with the genuine debate and disagreements in science at a time when it's evolving so fast is very difficult. But so when I say that you have to, you know, the ethical dilemmas are the same. So, you know, I think that, you know, there are good and bad science journalists, but the good ones know that it's not opinions weighed against each other. You have to get as much evidence as you can and weight the evidence according to its strength. And that's the way you construct your story. And that is complicated at the moment because of this way that science is getting out into the public arena through, for example, preprints, which haven't yet been peer reviewed, and social media. So there's an element of, you know, I mean, the disagreement starts with the scientists, and we're not immune. How can we be immune from it? We're trying to navigate that as well. But what can you do? You can quote your sources. You can, you know, admit that this is an evolving question and that this is just the best that we have now. Sometimes I do feel rather desperate because how do people choose which is the source to trust when we're all kind of groping in this way? It's difficult, and human beings have a tendency to listen to what they want to hear, not what challenges their opinions. So it's a genuine problem. I've heard public health experts say you need one face on the message, and you need to, you know, there are understood principles of communicating well in such an emergency, where you have simple messages repeated often, and you have transparency, and you do everything to establish trust between the state or whoever's communicating and the people. I think, you know, there have been successes and failures on all these levels. I mean, Mary was talking about frustration with the government response in the early days in China in this pandemic, COVID pandemic. You know, I think I've spoken to people on the behavioural subcommittee of SAGE in the UK who say things like, I don't know how well known this story is beyond the UK, but things like Boris Johnson's key advisor, Dominic Cummings, breaking the rules when he went up to Barnard Castle, did an enormous amount of damage to public confidence. And you can see it in levels of compliance after that happened. So, you know, it's everybody's in it, and we all affect each other's efforts. And that's what makes it so difficult to juggle.
Thank you for that. So there are questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to try and ask one for Mary that weaves in some of the strains. So some of the questions are about the differences in scale between local, national, and international responses, both one at the end of the rural campaigns in the Maoist period in China, and at one on the other, which I'm super fascinated by at the present, how China is presenting itself as a key giver of aid to foreign nations. And it kind of messes with our picture of the US WHO hegemony. And it's, I guess it's sort of a repudiation of Trump's radicalization of the virus. What do you make of these images and ideas in relation to global public health today? And what does it say about our picture, which we commonsensically often take as global public health emanating out of the global north?
Thank you. So I'll try and be as brief as I can and also incorporate what questions I can into this. So yeah, I think that one of the interesting things about the history of global health is the way in which China has long been a part of global health, I would suggest. And in fact, a delegate from China was one of the people to propose that a global health organization be founded that led to the WHO. So there are interesting cases where I think China's always been a part of the story. But of course, more recently, it has come to the fore as a donor of medical aid. And we see that very clearly in COVID. But one of the fascinating things about the images of China donating PPE and medical labor to places like Northern Italy, nicely reversing the trend from east to west. One of the interesting things about that is how closely it echoes decades previous work of China in Africa and other places in the post-colonial world to offer medical aid. So for example, Tanzania was a major site of this aid. That's growing out of socialist networks of health provision in interesting ways. But we do see over time China building up a network in which it is the donor, not the recipient of aid from the 1960s going forward. And I think that's tied to the present day in interesting ways. There's a question from an anonymous attendee about commitments to saving face, Trump's racist blaming of China for the virus, as perhaps an explanation for why China's been more effective at managing the health crisis than other countries. What I think we see as a concern with for the Chinese state with being seen to be effective in promoting its methods of managing the crisis in terms of how we see that kind of medical aid working out and that medical diplomacy really working out. So I think that's something that I would point to. And getting back to the question of scale and perhaps to Tristan's very good question about the differences between rural and urban, I think that's actually part of the story of medical diplomacy as well, in terms of the ways in which it was China's rural health system in the 60s and 70s that was the model that the CCP was promulgating. And now we see perhaps something that's a little bit more concerned with places where there are great densities of people. In terms of the specific question about rural management of COVID, that's really a question for Miriam Gross, who is currently working on this. But one of the really interesting things for me has been to see reports of villages in China actually imposing lockdowns or imposing travel bans on people from other places. So I think there's an interesting question of the extent to which people actually embrace measures that they believe will keep them safe in China, and the extent to which perhaps, that's not necessarily something specific to China. But I think I want to pause there to get back to the questions.
Yeah. And that actually, leads me to one of the other audience questions that has come in, which is that we've heard a lot about how, the pandemic sort of exacerbate social and political sort of issues. But, we've been asked, are there examples of citizen engagement with civic institutions, community organizations that might be a model for the mobilization of citizens where where perhaps the state isn't as present or isn't as organized, isn't able to take the lead in pandemic management and mitigation? And either of our panelists could.
I think there has been, I don't know about any publications, but I've come across plenty of anecdotal examples of grassroots movements that were originally created for other purposes, more political purposes, mobilizing themselves to help their communities in the flu effort. And, that then has a kind of reciprocal effect and strengthens their base when they go back to their original. So I think there are really interesting entanglements there, as there were in 1918.
And just to briefly add on to that, it's been really interesting to see the material flow of PPE, of masks and other kinds of equipment. In Britain, there were many grassroots mobilizations to put together face masks for medical staff. But also, I had a lot of friends in China who were offering to ship PPE abroad to friends who might need it. So an interesting case of small scale medical diplomacy, perhaps.
And in my neighborhood as well, much of sort of the spring lockdown was spent with, making masks when masks weren't available. But did you have one last quick question before I conclude?
Yeah, just to kind of sum up, we have a few minutes. I was thinking maybe we could end with thinking about what Mary brought up a little bit earlier, the idea of the vaccine as a scientific technological fix. And what to expect going forward in terms of sovereignty and policing. Laura and Mary both brought up ideas about how there's this kind of global mobilization of nationalist rhetoric around who will have access, the flow of people and flow of protection. So just, maybe finishing thoughts on where we are and what it might look like to think about immunization and vaccination as politics of sovereignty going forward.
Mary, would you like to go first?
Sure. I will just say a few things. First of all, I think that it will be interesting to see, as we talked about at the beginning of the session, pandemics have a tendency to exacerbate and intensify existing issues and inequalities that are present in societies in different ways. And I think perhaps the global mobilization of efforts to vaccinate populations might reflect that in terms of the extent to which wealthy countries are buying up vaccines at a great pace. There are programs like, I believe it's called COVAX, to get more vaccines to some people in every country instead of a lot of vaccines to all the people in 1 or 2 countries. So I think that'll be interesting to look at those processes. I think it'll also be interesting to consider surveillance of states of immunity and the different ways in which immunity and individual states of immunity will take on value, perhaps in troubling ways, socially, morally, even financially. That's something that we've seen with yellow fever in the past in the history of the United States. And so I think those questions of when there is a vaccine available, what it means to have a state of immunity or not, will go alongside other questions that are perhaps more expected, like the logistics of actually distributing vaccines or the resistance that is anticipated in many areas to vaccination. So those are some things that I'll be curious to observe.
I mean, it's such a complex thing. I think it's really interesting at the moment that, because we're seeing this second surge, whether or not you think it's one big surge, you know, it has become that much easier to test the vaccines, because we can see if it's protective against the people who are being exposed to this disease now. And a lot of that testing is being done in Africa. So it's quite interesting how I don't know, the kind of politics of vaccine testing is, you know, even before we get the approved vaccine, it's political. And, you know, I think there are moves to make sure that Africa, being the sort of test bed, is also going to benefit in exchange. So that was one thing. And then I also, this is not exactly about vaccines, but I just had a thought about the previous question that I thought I would throw into a wobbly and then end on that, which is that it's not just grassroots sort of community, political organizations, social organizations that are getting mobilized, but also crime organizations, illicit organizations that have, for example, there was a report from Europol recently on this, showing that when they were stepping into the breach themselves to help enforce curfews, for example, in Brazilian favelas, but not just there, all over the world, convey health information, you know, give out food and medicines. It was a wonderful PR gesture, and you know, at a time when people didn't necessarily have the faith in the government response, that faith and trust was transferred to those organizations, so that could also have long-term consequences.
Thank you, Laura. On that note of licit and illicit, we're past, we're 55 past the hour, so we have to conclude. Thank you very much, Mary and Laura. This has really been a wonderful session. And please join us for the last session of this webinar on the 4th of December, where we'll be talking about pre-modern pandemics. Michael McCormick from Harvard University and Nukhet Varlik, an associate professor of history at the University of South Carolina, will be joining us in conversation with MIT's very own Malik Gacham. Thanks, everyone, and stay safe during the holiday season for those of you who celebrate Thanksgiving. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Laura and Mary. That was really wonderful.
It was great fun. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise.
Well, I will wish you a good evening in that case.
Yes.
Yes.
Be safe. Thank you for coming again.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.